Miss Marple and the Legend of the Midnight Caller. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, and it's such a joy to know you're spending this time with us. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And was your day a calm one or a busy one? Write a little note in the comments and be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Knock at the Door. Evening train from London deposited Miss Jane Marple at the small station of St. Hilary's. Me just as the autumn mist was beginning to settle over the countryside. She stood for a moment on the platform, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar yet somehow altered landscape of the little village she had not visited for some 15 years. Miss Marple, my dear Jane. Mrs. Partridge came hurrying along the platform, a stout, comfortable woman in her 60s, her face flushed with pleasure and the exertion of moving quickly. Dorothy. How delightful to see you, Miss Marple said warmly as they embraced. You haven't changed a bit. Nor have you, Jane, though I suspect we're both telling polite falsehoods. Mrs. Partridge laughed, but there was a nervous quality to it that Miss Marple noted with interest. Come along. My cottage is just a short walk. I do hope you won't find it too quiet after London, as they made their way along the narrow lane that led from the station. Miss Marple observed that St. Hilary's Mee retained much of its old-world charm. Stone cottages clustered around an ancient church, their windows glowing with warm lamplight against the gathering dusk. The air carried that peculiar dampness that presaged a heavy fog. You'll remember my cottage. Of course, Mrs. Partridge said, gesturing ahead. Still right beside the churchyard, though I confess the proximity to graves troubles me more now than it once did. How curious, Miss Marple remarked gently. I recall you found it rather comforting, being so close to the church. Mrs. Partridge's hands fluttered at her coat buttons. Yes, well, one's perspective changes, especially when one hears certain sounds in the night. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes grew thoughtful. The cottage was much as she remembered it, low, ceilinged and cosy, with chintz, curtains and well-worn furniture that spoke of comfort rather than fashion. Mrs. Partridge fussed about, showing her to her room, apologizing for the dampness, insisting that tea would be ready momentarily. Over tea and excellent seed cake. Miss Marple waited patiently for her friend to come to the point. She'd received Mrs. Partridge's letter 3 weeks ago, rambling missive that spoke of loneliness and nervousness, of village gossip and old legends. It had not been entirely clear what had prompted the invitation, but Miss Marple had sensed genuine distress beneath the cheerful phrases. You must think me very foolish, Mrs. Partridge said at last, setting down her teacup with a clatter, inviting you all this way for what is probably nothing more than an old woman's fancy. I think nothing of the sort, Miss Marple replied. You mentioned in your letter that the village has been rather unsettled lately. It's this business of the midnight caller. Mrs. Partridge lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. I know it sounds absurd, but people are genuinely frightened. 3 knocks on the door at midnight and then someone dies. It's happened before, you see. Years ago, legends have a way of persisting, Miss Marple observed, particularly in small villages, rather like the story of old Mrs. Harmon in St. Mary Mee, who was said to have been seen walking through the churchyard. It turned out to be the sexton's daughter meeting a young man. Mrs. Partridge managed a weak smile. Yes, I expect there's a rational explanation. But the deaths were real enough. Mrs. Cranston 5 years ago, and before that, old Mr. Gifford both had inherited property from the Trent estate, And now there's Mrs. Trent herself, living alone in that cottage by the green. She's been quite agitated lately, I'm told. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on a piece of pale blue knitting. The Trent estate that was the large house on the hill, I recall. It burned down 12 years ago. The old gentleman died shortly after. His fortune was divided among various connections and former servants. Mrs. Trent was his housekeeper for many years. She received quite a substantial bequest, which caused some talk in the village. Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound came. 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the fog-thick night knot on their door, but somewhere close by, the sound carrying with peculiar clarity through the damp air, "Oh, Jane." Mrs. Partridge's face went white. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose, moving to the window. She pulled back the curtain and peered into the darkness. The fog pressed against the glass like cotton wool, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Yet she thought she detected movement, darker shadow passing through the grey. "Did you see anything?" Mrs. Partridge whispered. "Perhaps, or perhaps not." Miss Marple returned to her chair, but her expression was alert. "These knocks, Dorothy, they always occur at exactly midnight. So the stories say, and always, 3 of them, very distinct and deliberate. How interesting, rather theatrical, wouldn't you say? In St. Mary Me, we had a rather similar case involving Mrs. Price, Ridley's nephew, who wished to give the impression that the house was haunted. It transpired he was searching for some old documents his uncle had hidden. The supernatural element was merely a convenience. Mrs. Partridge clutched at this rational explanation. "You think someone is playing a trick?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that when ancient legends resurface, one should consider who might benefit from their revival. But I may be quite wrong. We shall see what the morning brings." What the morning brought was news that travelled through the village like wildfire. Miss Marple was helping Mrs. Partridge prepare breakfast when there came an urgent knocking at the door. It was young Mrs. Baker from the post office, breathless and wide-eyed. "Oh, Mrs. Partridge." "Miss Marple, have you heard? Mrs. Trent is dead. Found by her daily woman not an hour ago sitting in her chair by the fire. And they're saying the knocks were heard last night. 3 of them, just like in the old days. The midnight caller has come again." Mrs. Partridge sank into a chair, but Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "How very sad," she said. Mrs. Trent had been unwell. Not that anyone knew of. Looked pale and worried these past weeks. Mrs. Evans at the shop said but nothing more than that. After Mrs. Baker had hurried off to spread her news elsewhere, Miss Marple stood at the window, gazing toward the village green. "I think, Dorothy," she said softly, "that we should pay our respects and, perhaps, I might have a word with whoever found poor Mrs. Trent. These deaths that appear peaceful often have the most interesting details, if one knows where to look." Mrs. Partridge stared at her friend. "Jen, you don't mean you think something is wrong?" "I mean," Miss Marple replied, reaching for her hat and gloves, "that legends rarely knock on doors without human hands to help them. Shall we go?" Chapter 2. A Death Before Dawn. The cottage, where Mrs. Lydia Trent had lived, stood at the edge of the village green. A neat stone structure with a slate roof and a well-tended garden that spoke of orderly habits. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Partridge approached, they found a small knot of villagers gathered at a respectful distance, murmuring among themselves. Dr. Haydock emerged from the front door just as they arrived. He was a spare, energetic man in his 50s, with iron grey hair and a nonsense manner that Miss Marple approved of instantly. "Morning, Mrs. Partridge," he said briskly, then turned his sharp gaze on Miss Marple. "And you'll be the friend visiting from St. Mary, me. Heard about you from old Dr. Griffiths. Said you had a good head on your shoulders." "How kind," Miss Marple murmured. "We were most distressed to hear of Mrs. Trent's passing. Such a shock for the village. Shock indeed, though I can't say it was entirely unexpected at her age. Heart failure, plain and simple. Found her sitting in her chair by the hearth, teacup beside her. Peaceful enough end, all things considered. Most fortunate," Miss Marple agreed, "to pass so quietly in one's own home." "Had she complained of any heart trouble?" Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. "Not to me directly, no, but she was 73 and kept to herself. Might not have mentioned it. These solitary types often don't. Might we see her?" Miss Marple asked. "I realize it's an unusual request, but Mrs. Partridge and I knew of her slightly, and I find that saying a proper goodbye brings comfort." The doctor hesitated, then shrugged. "Don't see why not." Constable finished his look round. "Nothing suspicious, just a natural death. Sad, but there it is. Mind you, don't disturb anything, though." He led them inside, and Miss Marple's keen eyes began their work immediately. The cottage was immaculately kept, with a slight mustiness that comes from windows kept too tightly shut. The morning sun struggled through net curtains, casting pale light across furniture that had seen better days, but was lovingly polished. Mrs. Trent still sat in her chair by the hearth, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hands folded in her lap. She had been a tall woman once, Miss Marple judged, though age had stooped her shoulders. Her face in death wore an expression that might have been surprise, perhaps merely the slackness that comes with final sleep. "She looks quite peaceful," Mrs. Partridge whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple moved closer, her gaze taking in the scene with the thoroughness of a woman who had witnessed too many village deaths to be squeamish. The teacup sat on the small table beside the chair, still half full. The teapot rested on the hearth, its china surface gleaming in the firelight. "May I?" she asked the doctor, gesturing toward the teapot. "If you must, though I can't see what interest it holds." Miss Marple lifted the lid and inhaled delicately. Her expression did not change, but Mrs. Partridge, who had known her for 40 years, saw the sudden sharpness in her eyes. "Such a strong blend," Miss Marple observed mildly, "almost medicinal in its quality." She replaced the lid and turned her attention to the room. It was then she noticed the cater, large tabby, sat by the door, watching them with unblinking green eyes. Its paws, Miss Marple noted, were distinctly muddy, leaving small prints on the otherwise spotless floor. "Mrs. Trent kept a cat?" she inquired. "Oh, yes, that's Brutus," Dr. Haydock replied. "Named him after Caesar's Brutus, stabbed in the back by those she trusted, or some such dramatic notion. Never let him outside, as I recall, quite devoted to keeping him indoors. How curious, then, that his paws should be so muddy." The doctor glanced at the cat with mild surprise. "So they are. Must have got out somehow." Miss Marple moved to the back door, which opened onto a small kitchen garden. The door was firmly closed, but when she examined the latch, she found it moved with unusual smoothness. "This has been oiled recently," she observed. "Very recently indeed. One can still detect the scent of it." "Perhaps Mrs. Trent was bothered by squeaking," Mrs. Partridge suggested. "Perhaps, though I understand she rarely went into the garden herself. Her daily woman, I presume. would have mentioned if she had been asked to attend to such a task. She stepped outside, and her sharp eyes caught something else. The garden gater, low wooden affair that opened onto the lane behind the cottage, showed similar signs of recent maintenance. The hinges gleamed with fresh oil, and there were faint marks in the damp earth beyond it, as though someone had stood there, shifting their weight from foot to foot. When she returned inside, she found Dr. Haydock preparing to leave. "I'll be making my report to the constable," he said. "Natural causes, heart failure. The woman was old, lived alone, and her heart simply gave out. Happens every day, I'm afraid." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I wonder, Doctor, about that tea. The scent was quite distinctive." "Just strong tea, Miss Marple. Some people prefer it that way." "Quite so. Rather reminiscent, though, of something I once encountered in St. Mary Mere case involving Mrs. Bantry's unfortunate house guest. The tea had been rather strongly brewed to disguise another taste, a bitter taste, one might say, rather like almonds." Dr. Haydock's face changed subtly. He set down his bag and returned to the hearth, lifting the teapot with more attention. After a long moment, he looked up, his expression grave. "You may have a point. I'll take this with me for examination, though I hope to heaven you're wrong." "So do I, Doctor, so do I." After he'd left, taking the teapot carefully, wrapped in a cloth, Miss Marple continued her examination of the cottage. In the parlour, she found evidence of a life lived in comfortable solitude. Books lined one wall, mostly novels and biographies. Her writing desk stood by the window, its surface bare except for a blotter and an INKWELL. It was Mrs. Partridge who noticed the ashes in the fireplace. "Jane, look. Someone's been burning papers." Indeed, among the grey ashes of the morning's fire, there were darker fragments, the remnants of what appeared to be letters or documents. Miss Marple knelt carefully, heedless of her skirt, and examined them with great interest. "Burned quite recently," she murmured. "Within the last day or two, I should say. You can still see traces of ink on this piece." She extracted a small fragment with a handkerchief a corner that had escaped complete destruction. On it, quite clearly, was part of a London postmark and what appeared to be masculine handwriting. "Someone," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, rising to her feet, "wanted to enter this house quietly, the oiled latch, the oiled gate, someone who did not wish to announce their presence, and someone who wished to conceal correspondence that might prove revealing. But Janif, it was murder. Surely the murderer would have left no trace." "My dear Dorothy, murderers are very seldom as clever as they think themselves. They plan for the large things and forget the small ones, rather like Mr. Cargill in St. Mary Me, who remembered to establish an alibi for the time of the murder, but forgot that his shoes would carry distinctive red clay from the victim's garden path." She looked once more at the dead woman in her chair, at the muddy podcat, watching them with ancient wisdom, at the carefully tended cottage that had become a scene of possible murder. "The midnight caller," she said softly, "is beginning to seem rather less supernatural and rather more calculated than legend would suggest. Someone wanted Lydia Trent dead, and they used an old village superstition to disguise their purpose. The question now is, why, and, more importantly, who?" Chapter 3. The Legend Retold. The village tea room occupied the ground floor of a half-timbered building that had once been the old coaching inn, Mrs. Elmsworth. Its proprietress was a woman of ample proportions and even more ample curiosity qualities that Miss Marple had learned to value highly in her investigations of village life. Such a dreadful thing, Mrs. Elmsworth declared, setting down a pot of tea and a plate of scones with rather more force than necessary. Poor Mrs. Trent, sitting there all alone when her time came, though I must say, there were those who predicted it. Indeed, Miss Marple inquired mildly, adding milk to her cup with careful precision. Oh, yes, the legend, you know, the midnight caller. 3 knocks and death follows before dawn. It's happened before, mark my words. Mrs. Partridge shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Miss Marple leaned forward with every appearance of fascinated attention. How very interesting. I confess I know nothing of this legend. Perhaps you might enlighten us. Mrs. Elmsworth needed no further encouragement. She pulled out a chair and settled herself at their table, glancing around to ensure her other customers were adequately supplied with tea and gossip. It goes back 50 years or more, she began, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. There was a young maid who worked at the old Trent house, the big estate on the hill. Pretty thing, by all accounts, but with ideas above her station. She fancied herself in love with young Master Trenther, old gentleman's son. A common enough situation, Miss Marple observed. Rather like poor Sally Rogers in St. Mary Me, who convinced herself that the squire's nephew would marry her. It ended badly, I'm afraid. Just so. This girl, her name was Margaret Dainshee, thought he'd make an honest woman of her, but the family had other plans. Married him off to a London girl with money and connections. Margaret was dismissed without a character, turned out into the cold. How cruel, Mrs. Partridge murmured. That's not the worst of it. She was found 3 days later, drowned in the mill pond. Some said accident. Others said she jumped, but her mother swore she'd been murdered. On her deathbed, the old woman cursed the Trent family, said that before each death there had come 3 knocks at midnight, a warning from beyond the grave. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And has this curse manifested itself? Indeed, it has. Old Mr. Trent himself was the first 50 years ago, just after the curse was laid. They say he heard the 3 knocks the night before he had his stroke. Then there was nothing for years, until the estate was divided up after young Master Trent died in the fire. The fire that destroyed the house, Miss Marple inquired. The very same 12 years ago. It was a terrible tragedy. He'd become a recluse after his wife left him, lived alone in that great house with just a few servants. The fire started in his study, they said. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. They found him at his desk, overcome by the smoke. How dreadful, and the inheritance. Ah, that's where it gets interesting. Mrs. Elmsworth leaned closer. He left nothing to his London relations. Everything was divided among those who'd stayed faithful to him. Mrs. Trent, who'd been his housekeeper for 30 years, got the largest share. Then there was old Mr. Gifford, who'd been his estate manager, and Mrs. Cranston, who'd been his nurse in his final years. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on her knitting. And these people, they've all passed away. Every one of them. Mr. Gifford was first 8. Years ago found dead in his garden after hearing the 3 knocks the night before. Then Mrs. Cranston, 5 years back, same thing. 3 knocks at midnight, dead before morning. And now Mrs. Trent. What did they die of? Miss Marple asked with seeming casualness. Mrs. Elmsworth waved a hand vaguely. Oh, natural causes, the doctor said. Hearts giving out, that sort of thing. But everyone knows it was the curse. Everyone except those who think rationally, came a dry voice from behind them. They turned to find a tall, angular woman in her 40s standing by their table. She wore a well-cut tweed suit and carried herself with the air of someone accustomed to authority. "Miss Dane," Mrs. Elmsworth said, her tone cooling noticeably. "I didn't see you come in. Evidently, I couldn't help but overhear your recitation of village mythology. I do wish people would stop spreading these ridiculous stories about my great-aunt," Miss Marple inquired politely. "Margaret Dane was my grandfather's sister, the so-called cursed maid." Miss Dane's voice was bitter. "The true curse is how her memory has been twisted into a ghost story to frighten children and gullible adults." She sat down without invitation, her dark eyes flashing. "My great-aunt was a respectable young woman who made the mistake of trusting a man above her station. She didn't drown herself in despair, and she certainly didn't lay any curse. She was murdered, pushed into that pond by someone who wanted her silenced." "You seem very certain of that," Miss Marple observed gently. "I've made a study of the case. The inquest was a farce, no proper investigation, just a rush to verdict of accidental death. The Trent family had influence, and they used it to cover up an inconvenient scandal." Mrs. Elmsworth bristled. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Dane. It's the truth. And now, 50 years later, people still use poor Margaret's name to explain away suspicious deaths. 3 people who inherited the Trent fortune all dead within a decade. Don't you find that rather convenient?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "You believe there's a connection?" "I believe in facts, not curses. Someone has been systematically eliminating the Trent heirs. The legend of the Midnight Caller provides perfect cover. Everyone's so busy being frightened of ghosts that they don't look for the very human killer in their midst." "Have you shared these suspicions with the authorities?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Dane laughed shortly. "What would I tell them? That I suspect murder based on a pattern spanning 8 years. They dismiss me as a cranked, just another Dane with a grudge against the Trent name." She rose abruptly. "But mark my words, if there's anything suspicious about Mrs. Trent's death, it will come out. Some of us refuse to let the past be buried under convenient legends." After she had left, Mrs. Elmsworth sniffed disapprovingly. "Always been bitter, that one stirring up old troubles that are best left alone." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "though I've often found that old troubles have a way of creating new ones if they're not properly resolved. Rather like Mrs. Prothero in St. Mary Me, who discovered that a 40-year-old secret about a land deed led directly to her nephew's financial schemes." She gathered up her knitting and handbag. "Tell me, Mrs. Elmsworth, what exactly did Mrs. Trent inherit from the old gentleman? You mentioned it was substantial. Money, certainly. Some said £20,000. But there were also Jules' family pieces that had belonged to the first Mrs. Trent. Quite valuable. I heard, though, no one's seen them since." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Jules have a way of causing trouble. They're rather like chickens in that regard. You think you have them safely locked away, and then they disappear, and you discover that someone has been planning their theft for quite some time." As they walked back through the village, Mrs. Partridge ventured, "Do you really think Miss Dane might be right that someone has been murdering the heirs?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that legends are very useful things for those who wish to disguise their crimes, and I think that we should discover what became of those jewels. They may prove to be the key to this entire unfortunate business." Chapter 4. The Widow's Candle. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when Miss Marple suggested a walk. Mrs. Partridge, who had been growing increasingly nervous as the day wore on, agreed with visible relief. Fresh air and exercise, she felt, might dispel the shadows that seemed to be gathering around them. "I thought we might stroll past Mrs. Trent's cottage again," Miss Marple said casually, adjusting her hat. The garden looked so well kept. I should like to see it in better light. Mrs. Partridge gave her friend a knowing look. Jane, you're not thinking of going inside again, are you? The constable has locked it up. Of course not, my dear, merely an innocent walk. Though I confess I've been thinking about what you mentioned in your letter about Mrs. Trent seeming anxious lately. Did she confide in you at all? Not exactly confide, but I did encounter her at the post office about a week ago. She seemed quite agitated, kept looking over her shoulder as though expecting someone. When I asked if she was quite well, she said something rather odd. Oh, there's a letter I must burn before he comes. I asked who she meant, but she just shook her head and hurried away. I thought perhaps she was becoming confused in her old age. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. How interesting, not confusion, I think, but fear. She knew someone was coming, and she had correspondence she wished to conceal. They had reached the cottage by now. In the afternoon light, it appeared even more forlorn, its curtains drawn, its garden gate firmly shut. Miss Marple paused by the low stone wall, her gaze travelling over the neat flower beds and the small vegetable patch beyond. Dorothy Doe, you happen to know if Mrs. Trent employed anyone to help with the housework? Oh, yes, Mrs. Fletcher comes in most mornings. Has done for years. A very reliable woman, always on time, always thorough. She's the one who found the body, poor thing. Quite overcome, she was. I should very much like to speak with her. Do you know where she lives? Mrs. Partridge pointed to a small cottage just visible at the end of the lane. Just there, shall we call on her? I'm sure she'd appreciate the company. These things are very distressing for those who discover them. Mrs. Fletcher proved to be a sensible woman in her 50s, with work-roughened hands and the direct manner of someone accustomed to hard labour. She received them in her neat sitting room, offering tea which Miss Marple accepted gratefully. It was terrible finding her like that, Mrs. Fletcher said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. I've worked for Mrs. Trent these past 15 years and I never thought I'd see her dead in her chair that way. You arrived at your usual time? Miss Marple inquired gently. 8 sharp, same as always. I have my own key, you see. Let myself in the back door, as Mrs. Trent preferred. She liked her privacy in the mornings, would usually still be having her breakfast but when I came in. The kitchen was cold, the fire not lightened. That's when I knew something was wrong. Had she mentioned feeling unwell? Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. No, though she'd been on edge this past week. Kept starting at sounds, checking the windows. Asked me twice if I'd oiled the garden gate latch, which I had just as she requested. She said it squeaked too loudly and disturbed her sleep. Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Partridge. When did she ask you to oil it? Let me think, it would have been 5 days ago, on the Thursday. She was very particular about it, wanted both the back door latch and the garden gate done properly. Most considerate of her to think of your comfort, Miss Marple observed. These squeaking latches can be most annoying when one is trying to work quietly. That's what I thought, miss, though. Now I wonder. Mrs. Fletcher's voice dropped. If someone wanted to come in quiet, well, those oiled latches would make it easier, wouldn't they? A disturbing thought indeed. Tell me, Mrs. Fletcher, did you notice anything unusual in the cottage yesterday morning? Anything out of place or unexpected? The cleaning woman considered carefully. The fire had been left burning quite late. There were ashes from burned papers, which was odd because Mrs. Trent was very particular about waste. She'd save old newspapers for lighting the fire, never just burn letters or such. and there was a candle in the parlour burned down to a stub in its holder. A candle, not a lamp. No, missa. Proper wax candle, the good kind. Mrs. Trent rarely used candles, preferring her oil lamps, but there it was, right by the writing desk, with wax dripped all around the holder. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Might we trouble you to show us exactly where this candle was positioned? If you could draw a little sketch, perhaps. Mrs. Fletcher obliged, producing a pencil and paper. Her drawing showed the writing desk by the window and the candlestick placed slightly to one side. And underneath it, Miss Marple prompted, was there anything on the desk surface beneath the candle? Now that you mention, if there was a dark mark on the wood, as though something had been burned thereon in the fireplace among the ashes, I found this. She rose and retrieved a small object from the mantelpiece. It was a charred corner of heavy paper, no more than an inch square, with the remains of what appeared to be a red wax seal. I kept it without quite knowing why, Mrs. Fletcher said. Seemed like something Mrs. Trent would have wanted preserved if it hadn't been burned. Miss Marple examined the fragment carefully through her spectacles. The paper was of good quality, the kind used for formal correspondence. The seal, though damaged, bore what might have been a crest or monogram. May I keep this, Mrs. Fletcher? I promise to return it if it proves important. Of course, missed though, I can't see what use it might be. As they made their way back to Mrs. Partridge's cottage, Miss Marple was unusually silent, her mind clearly occupied with the day's discoveries. Jane, Mrs. Partridge said at last, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, Miss Marple replied slowly, that Mrs. Trent spent her last evening burning correspondence by candlelight, correspondence that she wished to destroy completely, using the flame of a candle rather than simply tossing papers into the fire where they might be retrieved. Someone was coming, someone she feared, and she was determined they should not find whatever those letters contained. But who? That, my dear Dorothy, is what we must discover, though. I suspect it has something to do with the matter mentioned. In the fragment I found yesterday, the matter of the jewels, she pulled from her handbag the piece of charred envelope she had retrieved from Mrs. Trent's fireplace. Laying it beside the fragment Mrs. Fletcher had given them. Even in their damaged state, certain similarities were evident. The same paper, Miss Marple murmured, the same hand and, unless I'm very much mistaken, the same sender. Someone who wrote to Mrs. Trent about jewels, and someone whose correspondence she felt compelled to destroy before his arrival, rather like poor Miss Greenshaw in St. Mary Me, who burned all evidence of her nephew's blackmail attempts. Unfortunately, she didn't survive to testify against him. Mrs. Partridge shivered. You're saying Mrs. Trent was being blackmailed or threatened or, perhaps, merely contacted by someone she had good reason to fear. But one thing is certain, the midnight caller is no supernatural entity. He's a very human murderer who uses an old legend to disguise his crimes, and he writes letters before he strikes. Chapter 5. A Letter Without a Stamp. Morning brought a development that Miss Marple had been anticipating. Dr. Haydock arrived at Mrs. Partridge's cottage shortly after breakfast, his expression grave. Miss Marple, owe you an apology, and, more than that, I owe you thanks. You were quite right about that tea. There were traces of digitalis in the pot, enough to stop an elderly woman's heart within minutes. Mrs. Partridge gasped, but Miss Marple merely nodded thoughtfully. I suspected as much. The bitter almond scent was quite distinctive, though cleverly masked by the strong tea. Digitalis has that particular quality, rather like the case of old Colonel Bantry's gardener, who used foxglove tea to eliminate a rival for his daughter's affections. The police have been notified, of course, Dr. Haydock continued. Constable Brewer is beside himself. We've never had a murder in St. Hilary's Mean, not in living memory. He's asked Scotland Yard to send someone down, but in the meantime he's trying to gather what information he can. Most sensible. Tell me, Doctor, has anyone examined Mrs. Trent's recent correspondence? I believe there may be letters of considerable interest. The constable mentioned finding some routine bills and noticized nothing of significance. Why do you ask? Miss Marple explained about the burned letters and the fragments they had. Recovered. Dr. Haydock listened with growing interest. You think someone wrote to her warning of their visit? I think it very probably, and I believe the postmistress might be able to shed some light on the matter. Would you accompany us there, Doctor? Your presence might encourage her to be more forthcoming. The post office occupied a corner of the general store, presided over by Mrs. Bellemere, sharp-featured woman who appeared to know everything that passed through St. Hilary's Mee, whether by post or by gossip. Good morning, Mrs. Bellamy, Dr. Haydock said. We're here on rather official business. This is Miss Marple, who's been helping Constable Brewer with inquiries into Mrs. Trent's death. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes widened. They're saying it was murder. Is it true? I'm afraid so. Now we need to know about any letters Mrs. Trent received in the past week or so. Can you help us? The postmistress required no further encouragement. She pulled out a large ledger and began flipping through pages. Let me see. Mrs. Trent didn't receive much post. Truth be told, a letter from her solicitor in London every month, or so, the usual bills and circulars. But last week there was something unusual. Go on, Miss Marple encouraged gently. 2 letters arrived within days of each other. The first came through regular post from London Good. Quality paper, masculine hand. I remember thinking it was unusual for her to receive personal correspondence. Then 2 days later, another letter came, also from London. Miss Marple inquired. That's just it. This one had no stamp, no postmark. It was delivered by hand slipped through the door slot early one morning before I opened. I found it on the mat and recognized Mrs. Trent's name on the envelope. Did you notice the handwriting? Mrs. Bellamy nodded eagerly. Same hand as the first letter, I'd swear to it. Very distinctive, rather. Old-fashioned and style-slanted. To the right with elaborate capitals. And you gave this letter to Mrs. Trent. I did that very morning when she came in for her pension. She went quite pale when she saw it. Noticed ucked it into her handbag without opening it, though her hands were shaking something terrible. Miss Marple exchanged glances with Dr. Haydock. This would have been how many? Days before her death. 3 days. It was the Monday and she died Wednesday night. Did Mrs. Trent mention anything to you? Express any concerns or fears? The postmistress hesitated. She asked me a strange question. She said, if a person wanted to come to St. Hilary's Mee without being noticed, how might they arrive? I told her they could take the late train from London, the one that arrives at 10, or they might drive. Of course, though, that would mean staying somewhere overnight. And what did she say to that? She just nodded and thanked me. Then she asked if there were any hotels nearby. I mentioned the Red Lion in the next village, about 2 miles away. She seemed to be thinking hard about something, but she didn't confide in me further. After thanking Mrs. Bellamy for her help, the 3 of them stood outside the shop considering this new information. Someone wrote to her twice, Dr. Haydock said. Once by regular post, once by hand delivery. That suggests they were in the area or had sent someone ahead. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. The first letter would have announced their intention to visit. The second was more immediate, final warning perhaps, or instructions. Instructions for what? That remains to be seen, but I think we should examine that second letter more carefully. Mrs. Bellamy mentioned that it arrived unstamped. That means someone delivered it personally, someone who was in St. Hilary's Me early enough to slip it through. The door before the post office opened. She turned to Dr. Haydock. Has Constable Brewer found this letter among Mrs. Trent's effects? I'll ask him directly. Come along, his house is just down the lane. Constable Brewer was a stolid man in his 50s, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the turn events had taken in his quiet village. He received them in his small officer-converted front room, filled with neat files and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple, I was just about to call on you. Scotland Yard is sending Inspector Craik down tomorrow morning. He's handled murder cases before, knows his business. Excellent, Miss Marple said warmly. In the meantime, we've learned something of interest. Mrs. Trent received 2 letters last week from the same sender. Have you found them among her belongings? Brewer shook his head. No personal letters at all, just bills and such. She must have destroyed them. All but one fragment, Miss Marple corrected, producing the charred corner of her envelope with the London postmark. But there should have been a second letter delivered by hand on Monday morning. It had no stamp. The constable rifled through his notes. Nothing like that in the cottage. I did a thorough search myself. If it existed, she either burned it, or the killer took it. The killer, Miss Marple mused. Yes, that's quite possible. The letter might have contained something incriminating, something that would point directly to the murderer's identity. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. Miss Marple has been examining the case quite thoroughly. Brewer, I think you should hear what she's learned. Miss Marple proceeded to recount their discoveries, the oiled latches, the muddy cat, the burned correspondence, and the fragments suggesting letters about jewels. The constable listened with growing respect. So you think someone wrote to Mrs. Trent, arranged to visit her, and then poisoned her tea, he summarized. I think someone wished her dead and used the legend of the midnight caller to disguise their crime. The 3 knocks were deliberate theatre meant to make the death appear supernatural, but the reality is far more calculated. She paused, then continued carefully. Constably wonder if you might make inquiries at the Red Lion in the next village. Someone may have taken a room there recently, asking about St. Hilary's, me, or about Mrs. Trent specifically. I'll send word immediately, though they may not remember much about their guests. On the contrary, Miss Marple said with a slight smile, hotels always remember unusual guest sound. I suspect our murderer, despite his careful planning, will prove to have been quite memorable indeed. Clever people so often are in ways they don't anticipate. Chapter 6. The constable's tail Inspector Craik arrived on the morning train, a lean, intelligent-looking man in his 40s, who immediately impressed Miss Marple with his methodical approach to the case. Constable Brewer had briefed him thoroughly, and he requested a meeting with Miss Marple before beginning his official investigation. They met in Mrs. Partridge's sitting room, where Miss Marple had laid out the fragments of evidence like pieces of a puzzle on the tea table. Constable Brewer speaks very highly of your observations, Miss Marple, Inspector Craik said, accepting a cup of tea. He says you noticed the bitter almond scent immediately. One learns to be attentive to such things in a small village, Miss Marple replied modestly. We had a similar case in St. Mary Me some years ago. The scent is quite distinctive once you've encountered it. I understand you've also been investigating the letters Mrs. Trent received. Most enterprising of you. Miss Marple smiled gently. Merely asking questions, Inspector. The postmistress was most helpful. I believe the letters are central to understanding why Mrs. Trent was killed. So do I, which is why I'm particularly interested in what Constable Brewer observed the night of the murder. Brewer, would you tell Miss Marple what you told me? The constable shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's not much, sir. I was making my usual rounds that evening, checking that all was secure in the village. The fog was thick, mind you, very thick, indeed made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. What time was this? Miss Marple inquired. Between 11 and midnight. Always make a final circuit before turning in. That's when I saw him. Him, a gentleman walking along the lane that leads past Mrs. Trent's cottage. Tall fellow wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a walking stick. Had his hat pulled low, couldn't see his face clearly through the fog. Did he see you? Don't think so. He was moving purposefully, like a man who knew where he was going. I called out, "Good evening," but he didn't respond. Dan just kept walking. I assumed it was the vicar, Reverend Caldwell. He sometimes makes late visits to parishioners. The build was about right. But it wasn't the vicar, Miss Marple prompted. No. Miss, I checked with him the next morning, soon as I heard about Mrs. Trent. He says he was in his study all evening, never left the vicarage. His housekeeper confirms it. Inspector Craik leaned forward. Which means someone else was walking toward Mrs. Trent's cottage at approximately the time the 3 knocks were heard. Someone who deliberately ignored the constable and continued on their way. Did you notice anything else about this man, Constable? Miss Marple asked. His gait, perhaps, or the way he carried his stick. Brewer thought carefully. Now you mention it, he had a distinctive walk. Not a limp exactly, but a sort of measured tread-like. Someone who was being very careful where they placed their feet. And the stick, he used it quite regularly, tapping it on the ground as he walked. A man who needed the support of a stick or wished to give that impression. There's more, Inspector Craik said. Tell them about the door, Brewer. Ah, yes. When I found Mrs. Trent the next morning, after Mrs. Fletcher raised the alarm, the front door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, mind you, just unlatched. But here's the curious thing, the key was still in the lock on the inside. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The inside? Yes, Miss turned in the lock as if she'd locked herself in for the night. But the door was open nonetheless. How very interesting. That suggests the killer had his own key, doesn't it? He let himself in, did what he came to do, and departed. But he couldn't lock the door behind him with Mrs. Trent's key still in the lock on the inside. Inspector Craik nodded approvingly. Exactly my conclusion. The question is, how did he obtain a duplicate key? Mrs. Trent was housekeeper at the old Trent estate for 30 years, Miss Marple observed. I imagine she would have had keys to various properties. When the house burned down and the estate was settled, those keys might have been overlooked or kept as mementos or stolen, or borrowed and copied, Mrs. Partridge suggested nervously, rather like the case of Mrs. Spenlow's nephew in St. Mary Me, who borrowed his aunt's keys under the pretense of checking her locks but really wanted access to her jewelry box. Inspector Craik made a note in his book. I've sent inquiries to London about the Trent family and their associates. The solicitor who handled the estate Arthur Dane died 3 years ago, but he had a nephew, Henry Dane, who inherited his practice. Henry Dane, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Would this be the same Dane family as Miss Dane, the woman who spoke to us in the tea room? Her cousin, I believe, though, from what I understand, they're not on speaking terms. Family dispute over the old scandal involving Margaret Dane. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured. A solicitor would have access to all the estate records, including information about keys, jewellery, and the various bequests. He would also know how to forge legal documents if necessary. You think this Henry Dane might be our man? Constable Brewer asked. I think he bears investigation. Inspector, might I ask if you've made inquiries at the Red Lion Inn? I have indeed. A gentleman matching the description took a room there 5 days ago, gave his name as Mr. Henderson from London. Kept to himself, but the landlord noticed he asked several questions about St. Hilary's Mead, particularly about the old Trent estate. And did this Mr. Henderson have a walking stick? He did a handsome one with a silver handle, the landlord said. Rather distinctive. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the quiet village street. I think we should look for marks made by this distinctive stick. Constable Brewer mentioned that the man he saw was tapping it regularly on the ground in soft earth or mud. It would leave quite a clear impression. Inspector Craik stood immediately. Capital idea. Shall we examine Mrs. Trent's doorstep? They made their way to the cottage now, cordoned off as a crime scene. In the soft earth beside the front step, partially obscured by later footprints, were several round impressions, each about an inch in diameter. Farrell, Inspector Craik said with satisfaction, the metal tip of a walking stick. And look here on the doorstep itself. On the worn stone, barely visible but present nonetheless, was a fresh scratch, the kind that might be made by a metal ferrule striking stone. Our killer stood here, Miss Marple said quietly, perhaps waiting to be admitted or steeling himself for what he was about to do. He rapped 3 times with his stick on the door, creating the famous midnight knock. Then he used his duplicate key to enter. But why the elaborate charade? Mrs. Partridge asked. Why not simply enter quietly? Because, Miss Marple replied, he wanted everyone to believe the legend had come true. The supernatural explanation would discourage too close an investigation, and it nearly worked. If Dr. Haydock hadn't tested that tea, Mrs. Trent's death would have been attributed to heart failure brought on by fear of the midnight caller. Inspector Craik examined the marks thoughtfully. I need to speak with this Henry Dane. Do you know where he might be found? I believe, Miss Marple said, that he's returned to the village. Mrs. Elmsworth mentioned yesterday that young Mr. Dane had come back to settle family affairs. I suspect he's staying at his late uncle's property, the old Dane house near the church. Then we shall pay him a visit. Miss Marple, would you care to accompany me? Your observations have been invaluable thus far. I should be delighted, Inspector, though I suggest we approach the matter delicately. Clever murderers can be quite dangerous when they feel cornered. Chapter 7. Footsteps in the lane. The old Dane property sat at the far end of the village, separated from the church by a narrow lane that had once been well travelled but now showed signs of neglect. The house itself was a modest Georgian structure, its windows shuttered. Its garden, overgrown with brambles and ivy, hasn't been properly occupied in years, Constable Brewer observed as they approached. After old Arthur Dane died, the nephew let it sit empty, Said he'd sell it eventually, but nothing ever came of it. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, her sharp eyes taking in the details. The gate hung slightly askew on its hinges, and the path beyond was choked with weeds. Yet something caught her attention. Inspector F, you would observe the path. There are footprints in the mud, quite recent ones. By the look of them, indeed, the soft earth near the gate showed clear impressions of boots leading from the lane toward the house and back again. Someone's been here within the last day or two, Inspector Craik said, kneeling to examine them more closely. The prints are sharp, not yet degraded by rain. And there, Miss Marple pointed with her umbrella, are the marks of a walking stick, the same spacing, the same depth as those we found at Mrs. Trent's cottage. They followed the trail through the overgrown garden. The house appeared deserted, its windows dark, but as they rounded the corner toward what had once been a kitchen garden, Miss Marple stopped abruptly. Inspector, look there. Someone has been clearing away the brambles near that shed. A small outbuilding stood at the garden's edge, its door slightly ajar. Recent activity was evident. Cut branches lay in a pile nearby, and the door itself showed signs of having been forced open, the old lock hanging USLESSLY. Inspector Craik approached cautiously, Constable Brewer close behind. Miss Marple, despite the inspector's gesture for her to remain back, followed at a discreet distance. Inside the shed, they found evidence that someone had indeed been present. An oil lantern sat on a rough workbench, its glass still warm to the touch. Beside it lay a rusted ring of key seech labelled in faded ink. Estate keys, Inspector Craik murmured, examining them. Look, here, this one is marked LT Cottage. Lydia Trent's, Cottigan, lest I'm much mistaken. And this, Miss Marple said, picking up a small object that glinted in the dim light, is rather more personal in nature. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. The engraving on its face read simply, LT. Miss Marple opened it with careful fingers to reveal two miniature portraits inside. One showed a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes. The other depicted a man with sharp, angular features and an expression of cold intelligence. Lydia Trent, in her youth, Miss Marple said softly, and unless I'm very much mistaken, this is Arthur Dane. Inspector Craik examined the portraits with interest. So there was a connection between them beyond the professional relationship of solicitor and client. It would appear so. A locket is a very intimate possession, Inspector. One doesn't carry miniature portraits of one's solicitor unless there are deeper feelings involved, a secret romance. Constable Brewer suggested. Perhaps merely the hope of one. Arthur Dane was a married man, if I recall the village gossip correctly. His wife left him years before he died. Miss Marple moved about the small shed, her eyes missing nothing. On a shelf she discovered a small wooden box containing letters tied with ribbon. The handwriting was feminine, the paper yellowed with age. These appear to be love letters, she observed, carefully untying the ribbon. Written by Lydia to Arthur by the look of them. My dearest Arthur, this one begins. I cannot continue to live this lie pretending that I feel nothing when you are near. Inspector Craik took the letters gently. Evidence of a long-standing affair, it would seem. But why would these be hidden here in the shed? Because someone has been searching for them, Miss Marple replied. Someone who knew they existed and wanted to find them. Look at the dust on these shelves, Inspector. It's been disturbed recently, as though someone has been systematically going through everything stored here. The nephew, Inspector Craik, said grimly. Henry Dane must have known about his uncle's relationship with Mrs. Trent. He came here looking for evidence of it. But why? Mrs. Partridge asked, having ventured into the shed despite her nervousness. What would it matter now after all these years? Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. I wonder if it has to do with the jewels. Mrs. Elmsworth mentioned the Trent family jewels that were left to Lydia. If Arthur, Dane, and Lydia Trent were romantically involved, Arthur might have promised her more than was actually specified in his client's will. His nephew discovering this might have felt cheated. You think Henry Dane believes Mrs. Trent had something that rightfully belonged to him? Inspector Craik asked. I think it very probably did. I think these letters might have contained information about where those jewels were hidden. Mrs. Trent spoke of burning a letter before he came. Perhaps she was destroying evidence that would have led Henry to the treasure he sought. They continued their exploration of the shed and the surrounding garden. Near the back wall, half hidden by overgrown ivy, Miss Marple discovered something that made her pause. Inspectors, there are more footprints. Here and they lead away from the shed through this gap in the wall. The gap was narrow but passable, clearly used recently as a shortcut. Beyond it lay the lane that ran behind Mrs. Trent's cottage, a direct route, Inspector Craik observed. Someone could walk from this property to Mrs. Trent's back garden without being seen from the main road. Precisely, and the timing would have been quite convenient. Come at night through the lane, enter by the oiled garden gate that Mrs. Trent herself had arranged to be silent. Constable Brewer looked troubled. But why would Mrs. Trent oil the gate if she feared someone was coming? Because, Miss Marple said gently, I don't think she initially feared him. I think she expected him. The first letter would have announced his visit, perhaps even suggested a reconciliation or a discussion about the past. She oiled the latches so he could enter quietly without disturbing the neighbors. It was only later, perhaps after receiving the second letter, that she realized her danger. And by then it was too late. Inspector Craik finished. She tried to destroy the evidence he sought, but he came anyway. They made their way back through the garden to the lane. As they emerged onto the main path, Miss Marple noticed fresh scratches on the gatepost, the kind made by a metal ferrule scraping against wood. He's been using this route regularly, she observed, coming and going between his uncle's property and the village. But where is he now? Inspector Craik's face was set and determined. That's what we need to discover, and quickly. A man who has killed once will not hesitate to kill again if he feels threatened. We must find Henry Dane before he realizes we're closing in on him. I suspect, Miss Marple said quietly, that we may not have to search far. Murderers, in my experience, rarely leave the scene of their crime entirely. They're drawn back like moths to a flame to ensure their work remains undiscovered. We need only wait and watch. Then we shall set a trap, Inspector Craik declared, and Henry Dane will walk right into it. Chapter 8. The key that didn't fit Inspector Craik's plan was simple but effective. Word would be put about the village that the police had concluded their investigation of Mrs. Trent's cottage and would be removing the cordons the following day. If Henry Dane believes there is still something to be found at the cottage, he said, he might well attempt one final search before official access is restored to Mrs. Trent's heirs. We'll watch the cottage tonight, Inspector Craik said. Constable Brewer and I will position ourselves where we can observe both the front and back entrances. If our man appears, we'll have him. A sound plan, Miss Marple agreed. Though I wonder if we might not benefit from speaking with Mr. Dane directly first. A conversation might reveal more than surveillance. You think he'll agree to meet with us? I think his curiosity will compel him. Men who believe themselves clever often cannot resist the opportunity to display that cleverness. If we present ourselves as merely tying up loose ends asking about his uncle's estate work, he may feel secure enough to speak freely. And so it was arranged. Inspector Craik sent word to the Red Lion that he wished to speak with Mr. Henderson regarding the late Arthur Dane's legal affairs. The response came within the hour. Mr. Henderson would be pleased to meet with the inspector at the old Dane property that very afternoon. When they arrived at 3 o'clock, they found a man waiting for them in the overgrown garden. He was tall and lean, perhaps 40 years of age, with the sharp features Miss Marple had seen in the miniature portrait. He wore a well-cut suit and carried a walking stick with a silver handle that caught the afternoon light. "Inspector Craik, I presume," he said, his voice cultured but with an edge of weariness. "And you've brought company. Miss Marple has been assisting with inquiries into Mrs. Trent's death. She knew the village in former years and has provided valuable context." Henry Dane's eyes flickered to Miss Marple, assessing her with the quick judgment of a man accustomed to evaluating people. "How do you do, Miss Marple? A sad business, Mrs. Trent's passing, though I understand it was from natural causes." "That was the initial determination," Inspector Craik said carefully. "However, certain facts have come to light that require further investigation. I understand you knew Mrs. Trent only slightly. She was my uncle's client, of course. When he died, his practice was dissolved, and I inherited his personal papers. Mrs. Trent received her bequest according to the will of his client, the late Mr. Trent. Your uncle and Mrs. Trent were close, I believe," Miss Marple observed gently. "We found some rather personal correspondence in the shed." Henry Dane's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "My uncle's private affairs are not a matter for public speculation." "Naturally not, though when those affairs touch upon a case of murder, they do become relevant." "Murder?" He managed to look startled, though Mr. Marple noted he was gripping his walking stick rather tightly. The tea Mrs. Trent drank was laced with digitalis. She was deliberately poisoned. The legend of the midnight caller was used to disguise the crime. For a moment, Henry Dane said nothing. Then he laughed, though it was not a pleasant sound. "How Gothic! And you suspect me, I suppose, because I'm Arthur Dane's heir." "We're speaking with everyone connected to the case," Inspector Craik said evenly. "When did you arrive in St. Hilary's, Mr. Dane?" 5 days ago. I've been staying at the Red Lion while I attend to family business here. My uncle's property needs to be sold, papers, sorted, that sort of thing. And you visited Mrs. Trent during that time?" "I did not. I had no reason to call upon her." Miss Marple spoke up, her tone conversational. "That's curious, Mr. Dane, because the postmistress mentioned that Mrs. Trent received an unstamped letter delivered by hand on Monday morning. The handwriting matched that of a previous letter from London posted from the vicinity of your uncle's old law offices." Henry Dane's jaw tightened. "Many people write letters?" "Indeed, they do, and many people carry walking sticks, though not all walking sticks leave such distinctive marks." She gestured with her umbrella to the fresh scratches on the gatepost, then to the ferrule of his stick. Silver handle, metal tip. "The scratches here match perfectly, as do the impressions left on Mrs. Trent's doorstep and in the mud outside her garden gate. This is absurd. Hundreds of men carry walking sticks, but not hundreds of men were seen walking toward Mrs. Trent's cottage at midnight on the night she died," Inspector Craik interjected. "Constable Brewer observed you quite clearly. He assumed you were the vicar, but the vicar was home all evening." You were moving toward the cottage at precisely the time the 3 knocks were heard. Henry Dane's composure was cracking. I went for a walk. I couldn't sleep. There's no crime in that. There is when the walk leads to murder, Inspector Craik said firmly. We also found a duplicate key to Mrs. Trent's cottage in the shed behind this house, a key marked with her initials. How do you explain that? I don't have to explain anything. My uncle was her solicitor. He might have had a key for any number of legitimate reasons. He might indeed, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. But you used that key, didn't you, Mr. Dane? You let yourself into Mrs. Trent's cottage after knocking 3 times with your stick, creating the sound of the legendary midnight caller. You poisoned her tea and left quietly, knowing that everyone would attribute her death to the old curse. Henry Dane stared at her, his face pale. You can't prove any of this. Actually, we can, Inspector Craik said. The ferrule of your stick matches the marks on Mrs. Trent's doorstep exactly. The landlord at the Red Lion can testify that you asked questions about the village and about Mrs. Trent specifically. And I suspect that if we examine your belongings, we'll find the source of the digitalis you used to poison her. Why? Mrs. Partridge burst out, unable to contain herself any longer. Why would you kill a harmless old woman? For a moment, Miss Marple thought he would continue to deny everything. Then something in his expression shifted and she saw the anger beneath. Harmless, he spat. She was a thief. My uncle left her a fortune that should have come to meet £20,000 and the Trent jewels, all because of some ridiculous romantic entanglement. She was his housekeeper, nothing more. But he made her his beneficiary. So you came to reclaim what you felt was yours. Miss Marple said quietly, I came to negotiate. I wrote to her, suggested we meet privately to discuss the matter. I thought she might be reasonable, might agree to share the inheritance, but when I arrived, she refused. She said the money and jewels were hers, by right, that my uncle had loved her and wished her to have them. His knuckles whitened on the walking stick. She laughed at me, said I was just like all the Danes, grasping and cold-hearted. I couldn't let her keep what was mine. I simply couldn't. Inspector Craik stepped forward. Henry Dane, arresting you for the murder of Lydia Trent. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. Henry Dane looked at his walking stick, then at the cottage lane stretching away toward the village. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might bolt. Then his shoulders sagged. I should have known, he said bitterly. Small villages always have someone like you, Miss Marple, someone who notices everything and forgets nothing. Not everything, Miss Marple corrected gently. But enough, Mr. Dane. Quite enough. Chapter 9. The caller revealed Henry Dane's arrest sent ripples of shock through St. Hilary's, me. The legend of the midnight caller, which had frightened the village for generations, had been exposed as the calculated device of a murderer. Yet Inspector Craik was not entirely satisfied. He confessed to the murder readily enough once confronted. He told Miss Marple over tea at Mrs. Partridge's cottage that evening. But he claims the jewels were never at Mrs. Trent's cottage, that she refused to tell him where they were hidden. Without recovering them, we can't fully establish his motive. He killed her for jewels he never found. Mrs. Partridge asked, How dreadfully pointless. Murder often is. Miss Marple observed her needles clicking steadily. Though I suspect Mr. Dane is not being entirely truthful about his search. He returned to the old Dane property several times, went through his uncle's papers. He believed those jewels existed and I think he had reason to believe he knew where to find them, but where? Inspector Craig asked. We've searched Mrs. Trent's cottage thoroughly. There's no safe, no hidden compartments, nothing of value beyond ordinary household goods. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked thoughtful. Inspector, when you arrested Mr. Dane, he mentioned that he had written to Mrs. Trent suggesting a private meeting to discuss the inheritance. He said he arrived expecting to negotiate. Yes, and when she refused, he killed her. But that doesn't quite fit the facts, does it? If he arrived hoping to negotiate, why did he bring poison? Digitalis must be prepared and added to tea carefully. It suggests premeditation, not a crime of passion. Inspector Craig frowned. You think he always intended to kill her? I think he intended to frighten her into revealing where the jewels were hidden. The legend of the midnight caller provided the perfect tool. 3 knocks at midnight, the spectre of death, approaching an elderly woman, living alone, might well have been terrified into cooperation. But it went wrong, Mrs. Partridge said slowly. She didn't cooperate. Precisely, Mrs. Trent had already burned the letters that might have given him clues. She was prepared for his visit, perhaps even defiant. When threats failed, he resorted to murder, but he never found what he came for. Inspector Craig leaned forward. You think the jewels are still hidden somewhere? I think Mrs. Trent was far cleverer than Mr. Dane gave her credit for. She had been Arthur Dane's confidant for many years, had managed a large household, had dealt with valuable property. She would have known how to hide something precious. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening village. There's one place we haven't thoroughly examined. Inspector, one place that Mrs. Trent would have had access to that. Arthur Dane would have trusted her with, and that Henry Dane might not have considered the church. Mrs. Trent was a regular attendee, I'm told. She would have had keys to various areas, perhaps even to the vestry or the bell tower. Churches are full of hiding places. No one questions a faithful parishioner spending time there. Inspector Craig stood immediately. It's worth investigating. Shall we speak with the vicar? Reverend Caldwell received them in his study, a book-lined room that smelled of old paper and beeswax. He was a gentleman in his 60s, clearly distressed by the events of recent days. Mrs. Trent was one of my most devoted parishioners, he said sadly. She attended services regularly, helped with the flowers, volunteered for various charitable works. I cannot believe anyone would wish her harm. Did she have access to areas of the church beyond the nave? Miss Marple inquired. Oh yes, she was on the church council, you see. She had keys to the vestry, the storage rooms, the bell tower. We trusted her completely. Might we see the vestry, Reverend? Of course, though I can't imagine what you expect to find there. The vestry was a small room behind the altar, lined with cupboards containing altar cloths, candlesticks, and other ecclesiastical paraphernalia. Miss Marple examined it, methodically opening each cupboard, checking each drawer. Mrs. Trent arranged the flowers. The vicar mentioned. She was most particular about having everything just so. That cupboard there was her special preserve. No one else was allowed to touch it. Miss Marple opened the indicated cupboard. It contained vases, scissors, wire, and other materials for flower arranging. But on the upper shelf behind, a row of pottery vases found something that made her pause. A small wooden box plane, unadorned, sat pushed far back against the wall. Miss Marple drew it forward carefully and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were the Trent jewels. Inspector Craig drew in his breath sharply. There were rings, bracelets, a necklace of sapphires and diamonds that caught the lamplight and threw blue fire across the walls. Even in the dim vestry, their value was evident. "Good heavens," Reverend Caldwell whispered. "I had no idea these were here." Mrs. Trent hid them in the one place she knew they'd be safe, Miss Marple said quietly. A place she visited regularly where she could check on them, but where no one would think to look. Churches represent sanctuary, Reverend. She must have felt her treasures were under God's protection here. And she was right, Inspector Craig said. Henry Dane never thought to search here. He was so focused on her cottage on his uncle's property that he missed the obvious hiding place. Miss Marple closed the box gently. She died protecting these in a way. She refused to tell him where they were when he threatened her with the legend of the midnight caller. She burned the letters that might have given him clues. She was quite remarkably brave, but not brave enough to go to the police. Mrs. Partridge said, "No, I suspect she still had feelings for Arthur Dane even after his death. She wouldn't have wished to expose their relationship publicly, to see his nephew arrested for threats. She hoped perhaps that by destroying the evidence and refusing to cooperate, Henry would simply give up and go away. Instead, he killed her," Inspector Craig said grimly. They returned to Mrs. Partridge's cottage to find Constable Brewer waiting with news. Henry Dane, faced with the recovery of the jewels and the complete collapse of his defense, had made a full confession. "He admits everything," Brewer reported. "Says he planned it for months after finding his uncle's letters to Mrs. Trent. Believed the jewels were rightfully his as Arthur Dane's heir. When Mrs. Trent refused to cooperate, he used the digitalis he'd obtained from a London chemist, claiming it was for a heart condition. And the 3 knocks?" Inspector Craig asked. "Deliberate theatre," as Miss Marple said. "He studied the old legend, learned about the previous death. Sand used it to disguise his crime. He thought if everyone believed the midnight caller had returned, no one would look for a human murderer." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Legends are powerful things, Constable. They shape how people think what they believe possible. Mr. Dane understood that Tand used it to his advantage. What he didn't understand was that beneath every legend lies a human truth, and human truths can always be uncovered by careful observation." Inspector Craig stood, preparing to leave. "Thanks to your careful observation, Miss Marple, a murderer will face justice. The Trent jewels will go to Mrs. Trent's rightful heirs, soever they may be, and St. Hilary's me can sleep peacefully again. Can it, though?" Mrs. Partridge asked nervously. "Will people forget the legend now that they know it was all false?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I doubt it, my dear. Legends persist precisely because they satisfy something in human nature or need for mystery and drama. But perhaps knowing the truth will make the legend less frightening and more a curiosity of village history." Chapter 10. The Truth After Midnight. Fog had lifted from St. Hilary's Mee by the time dawn broke on the morning after Henry Dane's arrest. Miss Marple stood at Mrs. Partridge's window, watching the village come to life under a pale autumn sun that seemed to promise better days. "Ahead, I still can't quite believe it's over," Mrs. Partridge said, setting down the breakfast tray. "That awful man using a legend to commit murder. It seems almost blasphemous, somehow. Human nature has always found ways to twist belief to its own purposes," Miss Marple observed, turning from the window. "Though I must say Mr. Dane's plan was quite ingenious in its way. He understood the power of fear and superstition in a small village." Inspector Craig arrived shortly after breakfast, looking tired but satisfied. He had spent the night completing the official paperwork and ensuring that Henry Dane was securely held pending trial. "He's still talking," the inspector reported, accepting a cup of tea gratefully. "Seems he wants to justify himself, explain how reasonable his actions were. It's remarkable how murderers always believe they had no choice." The justification of the intelligent criminal, Miss Marple said. They convince themselves that their superior reasoning makes their actions acceptable. I've encountered it before. Mr. Raphael's nephew in the Caribbean was just such a man, certain that his cleverness entitled him to whatever he desired. In this case, Dane believed the inheritance should have been his by right of blood. He couldn't accept that his uncle had loved Mrs. Trent, that the bequest was made freely and legally. Did he explain the other deaths? Mrs. Partridge asked. Mr. Gifford and Mrs. Cranston. Surely he didn't kill them as well? Inspector Craik shook his head. No, those were natural deaths as the doctors determined, but Dane studied them carefully, noted the circumstances, and realized he could use the pattern to disguise his own crime. The legend was already half believed in the village. He simply reinforced it, a most cynical approach. He claims he only meant to frighten Mrs. Trent at first. Inspector Craik continued. The first letter was an attempt at negotiation, offering to settle the matter quietly if she would share the inheritance. When she refused, he sent the second letter, the unstamped one, suggesting he would visit her personally. And she knew what that meant, Miss Marple said quietly. That's why she burned Arthur Dane's letters to her. Why? She hid the jewels in the church. She was preparing for a confrontation. She underestimated his determination, though. When he arrived that night making his theatrical 3 knock, she still refused to cooperate. He poisoned her tea and left her to die, assuming the legend would protect him from investigation. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. What puzzles me slightly is why Mrs. Trent didn't simply go to the police. She had the letters, the evidence of his threats. Why face him alone? Pride, perhaps, Mrs. Partridge suggested. She'd spent her life as a respectable housekeeper. To admit publicly that she'd been involved with a married man of N decades ago might have been too shameful. I think it was more than pride, Miss Marple said. I think she genuinely loved Arthur Dane and she wanted to protect his memory. Exposing Henry's threats would have meant exposing the affair, dragging Arthur's name through the gossip mills. She chose silence instead, and it cost her her life. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Miss Dane, the sharp-featured woman they had met in the tea room. She looked less combative, now almost apologetic. I heard they've arrested Henry, she said without preamble. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, for proving that my great-aunt's death all those years ago wasn't the source of some supernatural curse. Your great-aunt was murdered, wasn't she? Miss Marple asked gently. By the Trent family or someone acting for them? Miss Dane nodded. I've always believed so, though I could never prove it. Margaret Dane was inconvenient, you see, pregnant with young Trent's child-threatening scandal. She had to be silenced. And so another legend was born, Miss Marple said. The cursed maid who drowned herself and swore vengeance from beyond the grave. It was easier to believe in a curse than to investigate a murderess, especially when the suspected murderers were the most powerful family in the village. 50 years of lies, Miss Dane said bitterly. And now Henry has added to the family's crimes. He deserves whatever punishment he receives. After she had left, Mrs. Partridge looked troubled. It's all so sad, isn't it? All these deaths, all this unhappiness stretching back generations, and for what? Money and jewels. For greed, Miss Marple corrected gently, the oldest and most persistent of human failings. Young Trent was greedy for respectability and feared the scandal Margaret Dane would bring. Henry Dane was greedy for wealth he felt entitled to. Greed disguises itself in many forms, Dorothy, but it always ends the same way. Inspector Craik finished his tea and stood to leave. Well, thanks to you, Miss Marple, this particular manifestation of greed has been stopped. Henry Dane will stand trial and I'm confident he'll be convicted. The evidence is overwhelming. What will become of the jewels? Mrs. Partridge asked. They'll be held as evidence until the trial concludes. After that, they'll go to Mrs. Trent's next of kin. Turns out she had a niece in Cornwall who knew nothing about the inheritance. She'll be quite surprised to discover she's a wealthy woman. After Inspector Craik had departed, Miss Marple and Mrs. Partridge sat in comfortable silence for a time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and from outside came the ordinary sounds of village life, the milk cart rattling past, children calling to each other, the church bell tolling for morning service. Will you stay for the weekend, Jane? Mrs. Partridge asked hopefully. Now that this dreadful business is settled, I think I shall if you'll have me. It would be pleasant to see St. Hilary's. Me at peace without murders and legends disturbing the quiet. They walked to church that Sunday, joining the villagers who filled the pews with a sense of relief and renewal. Reverend Caldwell spoke about truth and justice, about the dangers of allowing fear to overcome reason, and about the importance of community in dark times. Afterward, as they stood in the churchyard accepting congratulations and thanks from grateful villagers, Miss Marple found herself thinking about all the small observations that had led to Henry Dane's capture: the muddy cat paws, the oiled latches, the fragments of burned letters, the marks of a walking stick, each detail insignificant on its own but together forming an undeniable pattern. You're very quiet, Mrs. Partridge observed as they walked home. I was thinking about legends, Miss Marple replied. How they endure because they flatter our fears. As I said to you before, but also because they're simpler than the truth. It's easier to believe in a ghostly midnight caller than to acknowledge that our neighbors might be capable of murder. But you never believe in the simple explanation, do you, Jane? Miss Marple smiled. I believe in human nature. My dear, and human nature, I've found, is far more complex and interesting than any ghost story. The only spectre that visits most villages is greed, and it always knocks 3 times, first with temptation, then with justification, and finally with action. The trick is to recognize those knocks for what they are before tragedy follows. As the church bell tolled noon, they turned into Mrs. Partridge's cottage. Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair and reached for her knitting, ready to enjoy a peaceful afternoon in a village restored to tranquility. Outside, the lane was quiet at last,